It's so good to see you all here in the Strassmeyer Hall, the blue auditorium now. It used to be called the red auditorium because the seats were all red back then. Some of you might remember that. But we're so glad that everyone is here. I've been given the privilege of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Marc Cortez. He's coming from Wheaton College, along with a number of other of our guests who are here from Wheaton College, and we're so thankful they're here with us. Dr. Cortez is the Dean of the Litvin Divinity School, which is the Graduate School of Theology and Ministry at Wheaton College. And he is a theological anthropologist, and also was the president of my dissertation committee when I defended my dissertation back about, I think it was 9 years ago. So glad that he's here and other guests from Wheaton, and we really look forward to his talk tonight. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Marc Cortez.
Well, thank you very much, and it is great to see all of you here this evening, or most of you anyway. And there's a rowdy Wheaton crowd over here that you might just need to ignore periodically. Should also say I'm a big fan of church history and tradition, so I kind of like the idea of just continuing to refer to this as the red auditorium and just let everyone be confused and never explain it. Just refer to it as the red auditorium. Anyway, thank you again for inviting me to come and speak to you this evening. It's always an honor to come and talk about something that you find incredibly interesting. And it's especially so when you also find it to be incredibly important. And I think tonight's topic falls in that latter category, the image of God. Or as we theologians like to say, the Imago Dei. If you have not figured this out yet, theologians like to say things in Latin periodically because we think it makes us sound smarter. Also, if you're not aware, most of us can't read Latin. Christians have long viewed the image of God as one of the most central Christian beliefs about what it means to be human. The first thing God ever says about us in the Bible. Let us remind ourselves of the critical passage. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That is an amazing statement. Right at the very beginning of the story, God emphasizes that these human creatures are his. These human creatures are somehow special, somehow vital to the story that is about to unfold. These humans are his images. Right, now that's a good beginning. But of course, as we know, the story as it unfolds from here is rather complicated. It's messy. It's painful. These human creatures have a tremendous capacity to do amazing things and a terrifying capacity to do horrific things. And I want to suggest that the story of the image itself as a theological concept has a similar complexity. This evening, I want us to explore some of that complexity together. We're going to look briefly at what I call the bright side of the image. I don't know if Monty Python is a thing in this part of the world, but I've had the song "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life" stuck in my head all day, and I thought I would gift that to you. So we're going to look briefly at what I'm going to call the bright side of the image, but I will assume you figured out from the title of tonight's lecture that we're going to turn quickly to the other side of that equation and spend some time talking about what I'm going to call the dark side of the image. Right? How could the image of God, this amazing concept at the very beginning of the story of humanity, how could it possibly have a dark side? And is there anything we can do about it? Those are the two key questions that I would like us to reflect on and at least begin sketching some initial answers. But let's start in a good spot. Before we get all negative about things, let's start in a good spot and take a look at the bright side of the image. Genesis 9 is one of the earliest times that the biblical authors take the concept of the image and use it in some kind of practical application kind of situation. And we get, whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed, for in his own image God made humankind. Right? The logic here is relatively straightforward. I'm going to pick a DVD. Wave your hand. I'm going to pick on DVD this evening because I know him and I haven't seen him in a while and it will make me happy. Right? So according to the logic of this verse, I'm not allowed to walk up to DVD after this lecture, say hi to him, give him a hug, and then kill him. And the reason I'm not allowed to do that is because DVD is a human creature made in the image of God. And James is going to take it a significant step further. No one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. Right? And in James's argument, that last bit here makes no sense. If a person is made in the image of God, how could I possibly curse that person? So now it's not after the lecture. It's not even that I just can't murder DVD afterward. I need to be mindful of the very ways that I speak to him because of the reality made in the image of God. Clement of Rome, one of our earliest theologians, just after the writing of the New Testament, says it this way. It says, you should do good too, and pay honor and reverence to man who is made in the image of God. Minister food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, hospitality to the stranger, and necessary things to the prisoner. And all that is what will be regarded as truly bestowed on God. And notice the logic begins with humans who are made in the image of God. So everything that flows from that, all of the motivation for behaving in these Christian ethical ways, grounded in the image of God. So that now the way I treat DVD isn't like, don't just kill him. Don't just be careful how I speak to him. Be mindful that the way I treat him reflects how I treat God himself. Image of God. At the beginning of Christian history, Clement says that. Toward the end of at least our part of Christian history, Martin Luther King Jr., for whom image of God was a key concept. But the real reason that we must use our resources to outlaw poverty goes beyond material concerns to the quality of our mind and spirit. Deeply woven into the fiber of our religious tradition is the conviction that men are made in the image of God and that they are souls of infinite metaphysical value. It's right at the heart of Martin Luther King Jr.'s understanding of the human person is the infinite value that comes from being made in the image of God. Many have argued that this Christian commitment to the image of God and its connection to value and dignity lies at the root of much of the Western tradition's reflection on the entire concept of human rights. So you won't see a reference to the image of God in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but what you will see is a lot of logic that historically has its foundation in the Christian commitment to the image of God. So there is a tremendous bright side to the image of God. Throughout history, Christians have long grounded some of our most important ethical actions and the significance of treating all humans with value and dignity. We have grounded all of that into the first thing God says about us, which is made in the image and according to the likeness of God. Now, if that's the case, If that's the right side to the image, it's really hard to imagine how there could possibly be a dark side, right? That's a really robust and powerful bright side. Where could a story like that ever possibly go wrong? Well, we're creative people. So I'm going to give us 3 categories, 3 locations where the image has had a dark side. I'm not going to suggest these are the only 3. There are others. And I'm going to speak largely from my understanding of the context in America, because that's the context that I know most well. That sounds terrible. Best. I have been told by other people that this represents fairly well how this story has unfolded in their context. The image in women. Gratian, another early Christian thinker, reflecting, he thinks, on what Augustine had to say about this. I had to write pseudo-Augustine in there because Gratian thinks he's reading Augustine. He's not. He's reading a different early person that people at that time thought was Augustine. So slight clarification there. But he thinks, as Augustine says, and he's affirming all of this is the right way to think about things, Gratian is. As Augustine says, this is the likeness of God in man. And here, man isn't like a generic term for human. He's specifically referring to the male. The context makes that clear. That he is created as the only being from whom the others have come, and that he possesses, as it were, the dominion of God as his representative, since he himself bears in himself the image of the one God. So woman is not created in the image of God. Yeah, I'm done, right? We'll just close here. Apparently there's a dark side in the room that we need to navigate this evening. All right. All right, here we have John Calvin. I just want to be clear, I like John Calvin. I'm a Calvin fan. I think he's got lots of good things to say, but he's still on my slide. So certainly it cannot be denied that the woman was created in the image of God. Great. I should be able to just put a period on that and move on to the next slide, albeit in a secondary degree. Right now, it's just 2 theologians, but it is representative of a tradition in Christian thought that either argued that women were not made in the image of God, or they were made in the image of God, but in a lesser sort of way, so that there's a hierarchy to the image. Men are fully in the image, women are less so. Now, when I get to do this in smaller groups, I like to throw it out and have us kind of brainstorm, like what might lead to that sort of thing. I'm kind of terrified as to how that would go this evening. So I'll just tell you, right? There are a few factors that are at work here. Some of it is based on a conviction that was grounded in a lot of cultural conceptions of their day that women had diminished capacities relative to men, particularly when we talked about things like rationality, free will, maybe morality, that men had higher capacities, women had lower capacities. And because of that, there was also a tendency to think of the image of God in highly performative ways, things that you do. Well, if men have loftier capacities, they're able to perform at a higher level. Women have lower capacities, they perform at a lower level. Or if you press the logic far enough, there may be things that women can't perform at all because they lack the relevant capacity to be involved in that kind of activity. So there's an overall kind of just way of thinking about what maleness and femaleness looks like with a higher and a lower relative to capacity and performance that led to a conclusion that the image then must be something that is quantifiable in a similar sort of way. The image must involve a capacity or performance that can be either higher or lower and assigned to men or women. Okay? So that's one aspect that's at work here. It's just a fundamental logic of how they think about maleness and femaleness. The other challenge in the conversation is Paul, right? Because Paul says stuff, and occasionally it's confusing. So Paul writes, "For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man." And of course, the challenge here is that that part of the verse says that the man is the image and glory of God. This part of the verse, we don't have a reference to the image, and it doesn't connect the woman to God at all. So historically, some people have read this as, again, suggesting a hierarchy where you've got God, man who images God, and woman who only has access to God through man. Right? So there's a gendered mediation that's taking place here, and they think that's what Paul is saying. If I were a New Testament scholar, and I'm not, I would explain to you exactly what Paul is doing in this passage. The one thing I will say is if you have read the first half of 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 11 is a fun chapter because the second half is all about communion, and we love that half. We read that half all the time in church, and we celebrate how great it is. The first half of the chapter is Paul saying stuff, and then New Testament scholars debating about what Paul meant about the stuff. Right? It is one of the most complicated halves of a chapter in all of Pauline literature, at least. So it's actually kind of fun when theologians write on the image of God, they almost always just skip this one entirely. It's almost like they just pretend it's not there because they don't know what to do with it. I didn't do that. I put it on the screen and made us think about it. The one thing I will say about it is I simply refuse to believe that Paul intends to say what I just described him as saying, where there is a hierarchy and women aren't really in the image of God, they're only in the glory of man. Why do I refuse to say that? Because Paul talks about the image of God a lot in a lot of other places. Every other place where Paul talks about the image, including elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, he is explicitly clear that the image of God is not a gendered thing. The image of God is for all people. It's a destiny that was given to all people, that God wants for all people. There is no distinction between male or female in Paul's theology of the image of God. So I only have two options here. Either Paul is just blatantly contradicting himself here and contradicting things he's going to say elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, and just as a heads up, I think that's probably not the best option, or something more nuanced is taking place here. My short version, if I were to guess, is it has to do with the fact that Paul's not actually talking about the image at all when he gets to the end. That his whole point is to talk about what the glory of God is. That's a different subject. Short version is, though, if we get back to why is there a dark side, it's because you have cultural conceptions that lead people to think about maleness and femaleness in terms of capacity and performance that can be made into a hierarchy. So you've got cultural conceptions, and then you have legitimately difficult biblical passages that have led people to draw the conclusion that a very large portion of the human race is either not actually in the image of God or is less so. The image of God and disability. Thomas Aquinas, again, caveat, I like Thomas Aquinas, big fan, read Thomas all the time. But Thomas does say things that are also sometimes confusing and lead people to ask questions. So here's Thomas saying, man is said to be made in God's image, insofar as the image implies an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement. It remains for us to treat of his image inasmuch as he too is the principle of his actions, having free will and control of his actions. Now, in the abstract, by itself, people could very easily read this and not really think twice. Right? It's image of God, it's describing in terms of intellect and free will. That sounds great. I have intellect, I have free will, I'm image of God, we're good to go. But the challenge, of course, is when we begin to think about what it means to have free will and to be in control of one's own actions, when you begin to reflect on various human conditions in which it's rather difficult to understand what it means to say that they have control over their actions. There are lots of humans who don't have control over their actions. So even a statement like this, my guess is Thomas Aquinas had no intention of saying something that might have implications for persons with disabilities, but he has defined the image in ways that historically have been used by people to argue that persons with certain kinds of disabilities are either not in the image of God or are less so. Emil Brunner, again, later in the story, the formal essential structure, you can skip that. That's a technical image of God thing. But the image, kind of think of it as an aspect of the image, cannot be lost. It is identical with human existence as such, and indeed with the quality of being which all human beings possess equally. It only ceases where true human living ceases, on the borderline of imbecility or madness. Now, again, I'll be fair to Brunner, hard with that slide on the screen behind me. He has an aspect of the image that all humans could retain, but he has a very significant aspect of the image that is lost by those who exist on this borderline between imbecility and madness. Right? It's an extension of the logic that there are human conditions that render at least certain kinds of human persons no longer the kind of people that we put in the category of the image. They're excluded from the image. And again, the logic seems similar. I have a way of thinking about human persons in the image that depends on capacities, and then humans having more or less of those capacities, or the way those capacities get connected to performances, things that we do, and then I evaluate humans based on can they do those things as well as other humans. Number 3, the image and racialized groups. Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1855. Then the white man hates him, here he's talking about Native Americans, and hunts him down like the wild beasts of the forest. And read this next part carefully. And so the red crayon sketch is rubbed out, right? Red being a reference to the red skin of the Native Americans. So the red crayon sketch is rubbed out as they're killing the Native Americans. And the canvas is ready for a picture of manhood a little more like God's own image. Right, so the metaphor is you have a canvas with a painting on it, and the painting has Native Americans on it. And the image of the metaphor is of the Native Americans being wiped off the canvas, specifically to create a place for a painting that is more like God's image. In 1900, or about 50 years later, Charles Carroll published a book with a title that questioned whether we should view a black person as a beast or in the image of God. The answer, of course, was the first, and that book was republished as late as 1967 in America. So that Christine Thiel, Racism in the Image of God, referring really to kind of the whole breadth of things that we're describing, but really referring obviously specifically to racism. The notion of the human person as made in the image and likeness of God has made it dangerously easy to dismiss some individual persons and groups of people as less human than others. This reasoning has had terrible consequences. It is the appalling history of racism in all its forms. Right, so in all 3 of our cases, we have a fundamental logic that seems to move from what looks like a very clear biblical affirmation at the beginning of the story. All humans, male and female, made in the image of God. That's where our story started. And on the male-female bit, Genesis is really clear. Right? Male and female, he created them. That's where the story started. Somehow we get from that to very large groups of people, either being excluded from the image or being denigrated, kind of lowered in the image category because of a logic that reflected primarily on a person's our perceptions of a person's capacities or their ability to perform on the basis of those capacities. That's what I want to call the dark side of the image. Right? It's based on a particular way of thinking, what I call the what question. Right? What are humans? And answering that question primarily in terms of particular capacities. And the how question. How do humans live? So that we define the image primarily as a performative thing, a thing that we do, and then we begin to evaluate how image are you? based on how well you do or do not perform with respect to the image. If you answer, I think, either the what or the how question, in terms of that kind of capacity, performance, way of thinking, even if you don't intend to, you are creating a framework for the dark side of the image. So that, again, even if you don't intend to, I think you're opening the door to what has been a tragic history in Christian thought toward denigrating the full image-bearing status of certain kinds of human persons. I don't know why I did that twice. How am I doing here? All right, I'm actually going to skip most of this momentarily. I can come back later when we have questions. This is kind of a standard way of categorizing or organizing different views of the image historically. So some kind of explicitly define the image in terms of, the most important one would be in terms of rationality, that we are rational creatures, reasoning creatures. Some have done it primarily in terms of a function, which is a different way of using language that I've been calling performance. The function here is primarily defined in terms of dominion, that the function that we've been given is to rule over creation, whatever we mean by that, and perform that function in the world. I can come back and explain in the Q&A later why I think historically those two views have gone wrong, and I have some theologians that I really respect who fall in both of those categories. The third one, relationship, is a newer, kind of more modern way of thinking about the image that is, for many people, trying to get around some of the capacity, performance, language worries that I've just been talking about. I should mention before I skip past this one entirely that this one often confuses people when talking about the image of God, because there's an important sense in which all ways of thinking about the image of God are relational, because the very concept of the image of God involves the relationship between God and the creature who's doing the imaging. Right? So every view of the image is relational in the sense of a God-human relationship. In modern theology, there's been a shift toward emphasizing not just the God-human, as important as that is, but the human-human. A relational view of the image is that we are imaging God, not in terms of our individual capacities or the functions that we carry out, but the relationships that we have among each other. So it's my relationship, well, not with DVD because I killed him already. So it's my relationship with Dalibor, right? That is, as we kind of engage in relationship, right? There we go. We are imaging a God who is himself relational. Right? Lots in that view to celebrate, and I can explain in the Q&A why I don't fall in that category either. The short version is I think most people who like this view actually smuggle in one of the capacity or function views without admitting it. That's the short version of my concern. If you hear them talk about what a relational view is, they will very quickly start talking about, oh, what's cool about us is our capacity for relationship. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's just number one. Like you literally said the word capacity, right? So that's just a number one there. Or they'll turn relationship into a verb. And they'll say, what's really cool about us is we relate to one another. Yeah, that's just two, right? Now you're just doing something. You're performing a thing. The thing you're performing is relating, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still a performance in there. That doesn't mean three's wrong. I just think three people need to admit what they're doing, and they've found either a capacity or a function that they like better than the other capacities or functions that have been named in the history of theology, and then explain why that's a good idea. And then I always have to list number four, because number four is for people who are like, these all have problems, and I'm worried about them, so I'm just going to affirm all of them. It's kind of the all of the above choice here. And I always warn my students that in theology, if your theology professor gives you a list of like 5 options, the one that says all of the above is always the hardest one to defend, not the easiest. Right? It's always the most complicated because you have to navigate the strengths and the weaknesses of all of the things you're affirming. Right? So, again, we can come back here later if we want to. What I want to do is I want to suggest a different way of thinking about the image. So if I had done this the way most people do, right, is I walk through and explain why all the other ones are wrong, and then I explain mine, and it comes across as like the knight in shining armor saving the day at the end. But I do want to kind of offer to you how I think about the image, partly because I want us to reflect together on whether or not it succeeds. Right? If the worry is that the image has a dark side, then the thing we ought to be trying to do together is to find ways of thinking about the image that are biblical and that avoid the dark side temptation. So my question for you at the end will be, does this succeed? I can't answer that for you now because I have to explain it first. So let's go back to our text. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. And what I want to do first is I want to pause for a second and ask what those two terms mean. Like, as words, what do they mean in the text? And you will find in the literature, people will sometimes say, we don't know what the image of God means because the text doesn't tell us. Well, that's true, right? The text doesn't say, in the image according to the likeness, parentheses, by that, here's what I mean, definition, citation of dictionary article, right? That's not how the text reads. What it does is it drops two words into the text without definition. Right? When do you normally use two words when you're writing without defining them? It's normally when you're assuming your readers know what you're talking about. Right? So, if image and likeness have been dropped into our text without definition, we should ask ourselves, how are these two terms most commonly used in the broader cultural context of Genesis? Because that's probably what would have been in mind when somebody was reading the text. If you take the concept of idols, I should have prepared you that I was going to start talking about idols more. Idols are kind of a big deal in the ancient world, and the Old Testament alone has something like 17 different words for idols. I think it's even more than that. This isn't all of them. But if you map out, kind of list out all of the different words that the Old Testament uses for idols, it's going to look something like this. This is sometimes referred to as a semantic domain. You only need to know that if you want to impress one of your teachers later on this week. This is the range of words that gets used to describe idols. And important for our purposes is that those two words right there are the two words from Genesis 1:26. Right? Tselem is image, demut is likeness. Particularly when you use these two words together, like right next to each other in a text, in that cultural context, there is no way the people reading this text don't immediately think about idols. It's by far the most natural association with these words in that historical, cultural context. If you read most Old Testament scholars, even if they don't want to talk about idols very much, one of the first things they will say is that tselem and demut are terms that are operating within the concept of idols. Like, that's just fundamentally what the words refer to. Part of our problem, I think, in knowing what to do with that, I won't speak to your cultural context, but in the context that I grew up in, is we really have a terrible concept of what an idol is. So I know, I'm not sure about Chinese restaurants here. Chinese restaurants in America, many of them, not all of them, will often have a shelf that will have some idols sitting up on the shelf. And I remember sitting down to eat with my older daughter when I believe she was 5 or 6. And we're having a lovely dinner, just being together as a family. And about halfway through dinner, she looks up and realizes that she's sitting directly beneath one of those idols. And she begins to get very concerned. Like, can't eat her food, can't settle down. She's just anxious about the fact that she's sitting right below this idol. So me, being a good Western American father who has absolutely no idea what an idol actually is, right? What do I say to her? I say, don't worry, honey, it's just an idol. Right? It has no real significance. It's just a statue hanging out on a shelf. It could be a Santa Claus, right? It's just an idol. There's nothing going on there. That is a very modern, at least American, probably very Western, in at least some context, way of thinking about what an idol is. And to be fair, we again have some decent biblical reasons for thinking this way. Isaiah and Jeremiah both have fabulous rhetoric about idols. I like this one from Isaiah. So the blacksmith takes a tool and works with it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm, right? Emphasizing that an idol's nothing more than just taking some metal, hitting it with a hammer for a while, and boom, idol. Right? Or a little bit later, he's reflecting on wood idols. So half the wood, he, the guy making the idol, he burns in the fire. Over it, he prepares his meal, roasts his meat, and eats his fill. He also warms himself and says, "Ah, I am warm. I see the fire." Right, so he's got a pile of wood. He grabs half the wood. He comes over here. He's doing a little cookout, making some fire. I don't know if you roast marshmallows. That's what my girls would like to do over the fire. That's what half the wood does. The other half of the wood, he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, "Save me, you are my God." Right? And Isaiah wants to reflect on kind of the absurdity of taking the same pile of wood, using half of it for my marshmallows and half of it for your God. The problem, though, is that rhetoric, like lots of rhetoric, is making a very pointed point, but it's doing so by kind of setting aside some of the broader context. Isaiah knows full well that the people he's critiquing don't think of their idols that way. No one in the ancient world thought that an idol was just the other half of the wood that you took and shaped into some kind of statue. As far as I can tell, virtually every culture in the ancient Near East that we have significant information about had some kind of ritual around the creation of idols. The rituals all varied, so you can't get too specific, but by and large, it does start with having a craftsman. Somebody does take that other half of wood, right, take it back to their workshop, work on it, do their thing. In many of the contexts, though, it was a trained craftsman. Like, no one's going to give me that pile of wood and tell me to make an idol out of it because I have no idea what I'm doing. So it would take a master craftsman who knows how to shape an idol. But even the best craftsman in the world, who shaped the prettiest statue possible out of that wood, does not give you an idol. When the craftsman is done with it, all you have is pretty statue. For it to become an idol, the craftsman has to hand a pretty statue off to a priest, right, who is now not a trained craftsman, but a mediator of the sacred, right, who can take that pretty idol, a pretty statue, through a ritual usually in some kind of a sacred place, so that by the time you're done with this, some divine being has actually infused divine presence into that pretty statue, so that the statue is actually understood to come alive, to be able to see, speak, eat, move. Right. One of the things I didn't realize for the longest time, that in the ancient world, when they would bring food offerings to the idol, that was not symbolic. I always assumed it was symbolic, that they were kind of just trying to represent that my God is alive. No, they literally believed that statue was a manifestation of their living God, and their living God needs to eat. When they washed the statue, it was because their living God needs to be clean. When they spoke to the idol, it's because their living God could hear. The half of the wood that it doesn't get used for the fire doesn't make an idol. The pretty statue isn't an idol. The idol is a divine being manifesting presence in and through some material object, so that the deity is here. That's what an idol is everywhere in the ancient world. I think one of the best examples we have for this in the Bible is the story in 1 Samuel 4-5. Not sure if you're familiar with this story. This is the story where Israel is about to go to battle against the Philistines, and they're terrified because they usually lose those battles. So their solution is to take the ark into battle with them. Right? And the logic is just straightforward idol thinking. Right? It's God is present in the ark, if we want to win the battle, we need to have God present with us. So we're going to take the ark, bring it to battle with us. That will force God to come with us, and we will win the battle because our God Yahweh is present. They are viewing the ark in very idle ways. Physical means by which the divine is present in the world, and then often, and where it sometimes becomes problematic, is therefore the means by which we can manipulate the divine and get the divine to do things. So they bring the ark into battle, and of course you can't control Yahweh that way. That's not how the God of the Bible works. So Israel loses the battle, the ark gets captured, and you all know, what do the Philistines do with the ark of God that they have captured in the battle? They take it back to their city. This, by the way, classic in the ancient world. If you invade somebody's city and conquer their city, the absolute first thing you do is you go into their temple and you remove the idol of their god, because you are quite literally robbing them of divine presence. It's not the idol's valuable and they can melt it down for gold. They actually never did that. I shouldn't say never. As far as I can tell, they didn't normally do that. If you actually think there's a god there, throwing it in fire, probably not a great move, right? They would remove the idol from the temple because they wanted to rob their enemy of divine presence. So the Philistines take the ark back to their city. They bring it into the temple of their god Dagon. They put the ark at the feet of Dagon. In ancient idol ways of thinking, that's not some kind of decorative, symbolic move. They are quite literally saying, my God beat up your God, and your God is lying defeated at the feet of my God. That is not a symbol in the ancient world. That is why it was terrifying for the Philistines when they come back the next morning and their god Dagon has fallen over and is now lying sort of at the feet, right, of the ark. It's never good when your God falls over, but particularly in that context, like think about it. They thought their living God had beat up the living God Yahweh, and now it has become clear how false that is. And their God has now been defeated and is lying dead-ish on the floor. Right? So they prop their God back up, also not a good thing to ever have to do. They leave, they come back again the following morning, Dagon has fallen over, and bits have just broken off and are flying all over the place. At that point, they're just done. Like, send the ark away. That entire story is an idol story. It's a story about divine beings manifesting presence through physical objects in very real and powerful ways. If that's what an idol means in the ancient world, how does that shape what it means when we read a text like this? Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, or as I have suggested, as our idols in the world. Let me make these human creatures, and these human creatures are going to be the material means by which I, Yahweh, will manifest my presence in creation. And then I commanded them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, so that these human creatures could be the material means by which my presence would fill this entire earth that I have created. I like Genesis 5. This is the other one that theologians tend to skip. I don't know why. It's a fascinating passage. So when God created humanity, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. Right? The fun thing about that one, right, is at the beginning, we have just almost a straightforward repetition of the image and likeness from Genesis 1. But then we have the text using the same language for the image to describe the Adam-Seth relationship. So whatever you do with the image, even if you disagree with me and go some other way of thinking about the image, make sense out of this passage. Your understanding of the image should work for both the God-human relationship and the Adam-Seth relationship, since these are the first two texts we have in the Bible that refer to the image of God. I particularly like this one because I think it works for me. In the ancient world, many of the texts that we do have that describe these ritual processes of chunks of wood becoming pretty statue, becoming idol as a divine being infuses presence into it, many of them explicitly use the language of birthing to describe the coming to life of the idol. They would talk about the divine being as birthing the idol as it becomes its manifestation of presence in the world. And they would use sonship language to describe the relationship between the idol and the divine being that is now present in the idol. So to me, if the ancient world is thinking in this way about idols, it is not at all surprising to see Genesis use the Adam-Seth relationship to describe the idol relationship that exists between God and his human creatures. And then Genesis 9 just makes all kinds of sense. Right? Think about it. If I go back to DVD over here, it was one thing to say that I should not just randomly murder him because he is a human creature that God likes for some reason. It is something else to say that David is the human creature through whom God is making himself present in the world. And that ought to shape how I treat him. Like if any of you all are idol worshipers, I hope not, but if any of you all are idol worshipers, and you've got an idol, not a pretty statue, but an actual idol on a shelf in your living room, and I walk into your living room, and let's say I take that idol and I just bash it with a hammer. Remember, you'd probably be annoyed if it was a pretty statue. But if it's an idol, physical means by which your God is making himself present in the world, and I attack it with a hammer, that's something else entirely. Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed. Why? For in the image God has made humanity. I'm really going to start running out of time. Exodus 24, I won't unpack this too much, but kind of the 10th commandment, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. I do want to acknowledge that the word for image here is a different word than you have in Genesis 1:26. It's one of the other idol terms. It is one of the idol terms that's consistently negative everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible not positive on idols and idolatry, generally speaking. Right? But what I think is actually happening here is the key at the beginning, you shall not make for yourself. Right? Notice the logic is not, there shall not be an idol. It's, you shall not make for yourself. And I think the negativity of using the term peshel, idol, the reason it's negative is because core to what the Bible typically calls idolatry is taking this whole idol thing on ourselves so that we're making our own idols and worshiping that which we have made, rather than recognizing our own identity as the ones that God has already declared to be the physical means by which he will manifest presence in creation. Right? Fundamental to idolatry is taking our identity and vocation and putting it onto something that we have created and then actually losing ourselves in the process. I structure this because the Old Testament comes first and then the New Testament, and then I always feel rushed when I get to Jesus, and that seems bad because I want to have more time to talk about Jesus. Colossians 1:15, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. One of the most startling things you run into in the story of the image in the Bible is this pivot that comes with the New Testament. Old Testament, very clear all throughout. It's all humans, male and female, made in the image of God. We get to the New Testament, and Paul's like, Jesus alone is the image of God. And then we're left kind of wondering, why the pivot? Why did we move from what looked like this all-expansive universal declaration of image for all humans to Paul having this very Christocentric notion that Jesus is the image of God. Well, I think some of the logic comes just a little bit later in Colossians. For in Christ, all the fullness of deity lives in bodily form. Right? Viewed in one way, this is just my definition of what an idol is. Right? It's what I just got done arguing, is how we ought to think about what an idol is. But importantly, the Bible does use idol language to talk about what it means to be made in the image of God, but also creates a fair bit of distance between us and God. There's no attempt in the Bible's idol image language for human persons to try to blur that line and make us think that we are somehow ourselves divine. Some people have argued that that's what's going on with the prepositions in Genesis 1:26. Right? That we are made in the image and according to the likeness. It's a biblical thing, so there's disagreement. Other scholars actually do read this as we were made as the image. You can research that if you want to. I'm inclined to think that the prepositions are trying to send a little bit of a message here. That the Bible does want us to think about ourselves using idol concepts, but be careful. Don't take that idol concept and blur the line between the creator and the creature. We are not identical to God, even as we are his idols. In the ancient world, they did sometimes blur that line. They sometimes thought about and talked about the idols as themselves divine, and I think the Bible is cautioning us. Don't do that unless you're Jesus. Right? There's a fundamental qualitative difference in how the Bible talks about Jesus as the image and how the Bible talks about the rest of us as the image. Jesus is the image of God because he is God incarnate. We are in the image of God because it has been our destiny from the beginning. For these God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. The goal from the beginning has been for us to be conformed to the image of the Son, who alone is the true and perfect image of God. That's the amazing good news for all of us, is that we are not called to do or be or accomplish this image thing. We are gifted this image thing in our calling to be conformed to the image of the Son. And then, of course, when we get to the end of the story, I just read Revelation, the end of Revelation, as a thoroughgoing celebration of what it means to be God's images, his idols. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them." God's creatures, the ones through whom he declared at the very beginning of the story that he would manifest presence, the one that he told to be fruitful and multiply so that he might fill the entire earth with his presence. We get to the end of the story. We should not be surprised to find out that God succeeded in accomplishing his purposes, filling the entire world with his presence through his people. That's what the image of God is all about. No. I also can't say bad things about DVD. All right. So how does this help? I'm going to ask and answer a few of my own questions about my position. But keep in mind that the last question I want to ask is, does this work? Does this help us with the dark side of the image? What do you think? First question I often get asked is, on this view, on my way of thinking about the image, can we have more or less of the image? And my answer is just a straightforward no. An idol is an all or nothing reality. You are either pile of wood, pretty statue, or you are idol, material means by which a God is manifesting divine presence. There is no space for in between on that. It is an either or. There's not even space for a more or less. It's just a fundamental yes-no question. Are you a creature that God has chosen to manifest his presence through? If yes, then image. If no, then not image. So it's not quantitative. And yeah, you can't have more or less of it. Can some people be more in the image than others? Well, no, I just said you can't have more or less of the image. So it's not possible for one person to have more of that thing and another person to have less of that thing, because there is no more or less in the image. A better version of that question, better is the wrong word here. A version of that question that would fit my view better wouldn't be, can some people be more in the image and some people be less in the image? It would be, can some people be in the image and some people not be in the image? Right? Technically, my position at least would logically create space for that, but I'm still going to say, you shouldn't be surprised, no. And the reason is, I have zero biblical basis of any kind for thinking there is any human creature that is not in the image of God. The Bible is just clear on that. So all humans fit in the image bucket, and within the image bucket, there is no more or less. It's all just image. Can the image of God be lost? Right? It's a slightly different version of the question. There is a small tradition within Christian theology that has Adam and Eve at the fall just straight up losing the image entirely. And after them, humans don't have the image of God until you arrive at the New Testament. Jesus, Pentecost, somewhere in the New Testament story, now you have an image-bearing story again. And again, I'm going to say no, and for largely biblical reasons. The Bible just never says anything about the image of God being lost by his human creatures. I will say, in the ancient world, there are stories, right? So if it's possible for a divine being to infuse presence into an idol, then it seems at least theoretically possible that a divine being could withdraw presence from that idol. Be like, no, I'm taking it back. And idol turns back into pretty statue, and it has been de-idoled in that sense. And you actually do have some stories in the ancient world where precisely that happens. What I find notable about those stories, though, there are two things. One, the stories always view that as a tremendously surprising thing, noteworthy, the kind of thing you would talk about. If a divine being invests presence into an idol, whenever that divine being withdraws it, everyone's shocked, which is why it's getting talked about in the narrative. So I would just find it implausible at best that the Genesis story would have God creating creatures to be his images. 2 chapters later, they fall into sin, and the narrative never mentions that Yahweh decides, yeah, no, you're not going to be images anymore. No, that would just be a shocking turn of events in the story, the kind of thing that a narrative like that would have emphasized, highlighted as devastatingly significant. The second reason I like the ancient stories is because in several of them, when the divine being withdraws presence, it is so shocking and devastating that it causes like earthquakes. It is a momentous event for a divine being to do something like that, making it even that much more surprising that the biblical story could pass over that without once, anywhere, Old Testament or New Testament, ever mentioning something that significant about human persons. So I'm going to say no, the image of God cannot be lost. Can the image of God be damaged? Why would anyone ask, can the image of God be damaged? Well, the short version is because you do have biblical texts that talk about us needing to be transformed with respect to the image. Even the Romans 8 text that we just read, where we need to be conformed to the image of the Son, makes it sound to many people like there's something wrong with the image, so that the image has somehow gotten broken in the fall and now needs to get fixed in Christ. I'm not going to say no to that with a full period on it, because I do think there are important theological reasons why people want to go there, and I don't want to say entirely no to that. I do get nervous about it. And the reason I get nervous is because it is very difficult to have a broken account of the fall without slipping into a more or less way of thinking about the image. Right? If the image is broken, how broken is it? Is it broken just as much for you as it is for me? Or are you more broken than I am? You probably don't have to go there, but just the language of brokenness, at least historically, has had a tendency to get people thinking about Actually, it's usually the other way around. It's I'm less broken, you're more broken, but we still have a more or less at work there. Now, I want to be clear. I actually do think we need more or less ways of thinking when reflecting on what it means to be human. Like, for instance, I talk a lot about human flourishing when I think about what it is to be human. We must talk about more or less in the category of human flourishing. There are ways of flourishing that are better, ways that are worse. A particular human can be more flourishing at one point in their life and less flourishing at another point in life. We need to talk in more or less terms when we're talking about Christian faithfulness. There are ways of being that are more faithful to the God of the gospel and less faithful to the God of the gospel. All kinds of places where we need to use more and less ways of talking about what it means to be human. What I want to do is I want to move all of that more or less way of thinking out of the image. The image is not a more or less thing. The image is just image. All of the more or less language belongs to how we live in light of the reality that we're made in the image of God. I am image of God, full stop. But I often live less faithfully, and I hope to live more faithfully. I am image of God, full stop. But I often live a life that is less flourishing. I hope to live a life that is more flourishing. Right? We have all the space that we need to talk about the more or less, which is a fully biblical concept, without turning the image into a quantifiable thing that then begins to get us thinking about people who are more or less in the image, which often means more or less human. In the image category, not in the image category. Is the image of God something we perform? I probably just tipped my hat there a little bit. No. It sounds like it. And it sounds like because there is a performance here. Someone is doing something when it comes to the image. But think about the idol, right? So I have pretty statue here. Pretty statue becomes idol. Did the pretty statue do anything? No, pretty statue is just sitting there. Pretty statue did nothing. The only person who actually does anything of significance in that story, I don't want to denigrate the priest in this account, but it's the divine being. Right? It's the deity that is the deity is manifesting presence through the idol. There is a doing here, but God's doing the doing, if I can say it that way. That doesn't mean, again, that my doing things is irrelevant. It's just I don't have to become the image. I don't have to perform to a certain extent to be image. I don't have to achieve a certain level of perfection in order to retain my status as image. I am image, full stop. As an image, I am called to live faithfully in the world. And there's all kinds of performance that needs to happen as I seek to live faithfully in the world. But it all follows from the theological reality that God made me his image. And then I live, I hope, faithfully in light of that reality. All right, those were all of my questions. I'm going to leave us with this question and then see if there are other questions. As I said at the beginning, I want us to reflect on, I started with a rather depressing account of the dark side of the image, the way the image goes wrong. And I want us to at least begin to answer the question of, does this help? Does thinking about the image in terms of idol protect us from the dark side or not? And you can feel free to say, no, you're not going to hurt my feelings. It's the Bible's way of talking, so. Or any other questions about any of this? Yeah, go Hazim.
Thank you for a fantastic lecture. You said that we don't have more or less of an image with us, and that we do not perform. Could you say something about the process of deification in Orthodox theology, and possibly something about sanctification in Western theology?
Yeah, excellent questions. They're going to get, so everyone heard that. So a question about deification and sanctification if we're not doing or performing, and kind of how they connect to that. And let me take them separately here. There are ways of thinking through a theology of deification that I think would resonate with much of what I've said, right? So that deification would be a process of, I should pause for a second here, so just make sure, deification as a term is becoming more godlike, right? As God transforms us through the power of the Spirit and indwelling work of Christ, right? So I'm becoming more godlike. Notice becoming more godlike. Right? So in Eastern theology, kind of orthodoxly speaking, it's you don't become God. It's typically that they'll use the phrase of you become as God as is humanly possible. Right? So there's always that, ideally, the protection of the creator-creature distinction there. So on that way of thinking, then yes, it's entirely possible to understand deification as the ongoing process of conformity to the image of the Son from Romans 8. Right? So he is the perfect image. I never arrive at his perfect status of being image, but I am, through God's action, being increasingly deified in that. And I would say sanctification similarly, the process of becoming more holy through the work of the Spirit. This is going to tell you something about my theology. I am going to emphasize that that is first always something that God does in me, but never apart from the things that he has called me to do as I participate in that process. So I do think if I'm going to unpack a theology of deification and sanctification, the shape will be very similar. It's going to lead with image of God, full stop. That's a thing that God does. Anything that I do follows from that, but hopefully not by making my actions insignificant. I actually think it gives them tremendous significance because it views my actions as the actions of a creature that God is manifesting presence through. Go ahead.
I have two questions.
Well, there are a couple of hands up, so let's go with one question, then I'll come back to you if I've got time.
So if this view is the correct one, that humanity being created in the image of God is supposed to be a reference to idols, wouldn't that then imply that God created humans in order to worship them, as humans create idols to worship the idols?
I'm going to say no. And that's going to go, so kind of, I'm going to go back to what I said, similar to what I said about in the ancient world, when they thought about idols, they did often bleed the relationship between the creator and the creature, such that the creature becomes identified with the divine and is therefore a worthy object of worship. Right? That is how the ancient world typically thought about idols, and it's why the Bible condemns idolatry. I don't think, though, that's intrinsic to the fundamental logic of a divine being manifesting presence through a material object. If I just look at other stories in the Bible, God actually does this fairly often. Right? We have lots of biblical stories where God is manifesting presence through material objects. I already mentioned the ark, you've got the temple, you've got the burning bush, you have the church, depending on your theology of the church in the New Testament. God is routinely manifesting presence through material objects. What is significant, I think, about the image of God is it is, as far as I can tell, a declaration that the image is permanent and universal. It's universal to all humans, and it is a permanent thing that God is doing in and through humans. Other kind of presence texts are at least, well, I'm going to say permanent about Jesus. Universal raises other questions. I say God's presence elsewhere is different in that. I think I just distracted myself from the question. All I want to say is there's a difference, I think, between what the Bible is doing with idol language and what the ancient world is doing with idol language. The Bible is saying there's a difference between the idol and God, and fundamental to that difference is you don't worship the humans that I have been created to be idols. What turns that into idolatry is when we take over that process, we begin to make for ourselves things that we can call idols. We begin to think that those things are identical to the divine, so that the thing that I have made with my own hands now is a deity, and I begin to worship it. all of that falls into the negative category. And it's why the Old Testament, again, I want to be clear on this, is almost exclusively negative about idols. It's very difficult to find biblical authors saying nice things about idols. And it's precisely because the ancient concept used not just, so the ancient context used not just the concept of idols, but it lived out that concept in ways that were fundamentally idolatrous and unfaithful. So, no, I don't think understanding the image this way results in worshiping humans if we maintain the differences between what the Bible is doing with the concept and what the ancient world was doing with the concept, even though I think the concept is remarkably similar. All right, back here. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture again. So, if Imago today is more about being than performing, so how things then can go wrong? Or my question is, how can we know then what we shall do? And just one appendix. I mean, you was criticizing those 3 or 4 different views today, but it seems to me that the view that you are presenting, it still falls to the category of functional. However, the functional, because the image of God needs to be manifested, so something needs to happen, so something needs to be performed, but the function is not on our part, but it's on God's part. Okay, going back to the question.
Okay.
So how things can go wrong if it's about being and not performing?
Okay, let me pick up with that one because I think I can answer that one faster. It depends on where you locate the wrongness, right? So my theology of the image, I'm going to say, yes, things have gone wrong. I'd be a pretty bad Bible reader if I didn't think things had gone wrong. I just locate where things went wrong differently. Where they didn't go wrong is with respect to the image itself. God made us in his image. That remains a truth, full stop. We are not less in the image after the fall than we were before the fall. We are just images. Where things have gone wrong is the way that those images have gone on to live in the world. Right? One of the things that makes us different than pretty statue, right, is that we are moral agents who go and do stuff. And I'll admit I have a hard time understanding why we went and did stuff unfaithfully. I think all theological systems have a hard time answering that question. The reality is that we have, and I don't think I'm then required to say that sin somehow tainted, broke, lost, did something to the image itself. What sin did is it tainted, corrupted everything that those images have gone on to do since then. And I'll just say yes, I mean, mine is a functional view, but I do think it makes a difference that it's a divine function. Because what gets me nervous on the performance language for the image is when we locate the performance either prior to being the image, I need to do something in order to be image, or as a part of the definition of image, so that if I'm not doing the thing, I'm no longer image. That's where I get nervous, and historically I think we've gone awry. If you locate the performance after, logically after the image, so that I remain in the image no matter what I'm doing, then I'm less concerned about the implications. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna go here and then here. And then here, because I want to make sure I'm not ignoring this side of the room. All right.
Very good lecture. I'm just trying to understand, like, the idol is made on the perception about God, right? So the image of God is reflected on the image of idol, of the likeness of the idol. So let's say a statue that was blessed by the priest to become an idol of Dagon, represent Dagon. But can the idol changing the form of the idea of Dagon and still representing the Dagon?
So if I'm understanding correctly, it raises the question of almost kind of the appearance or form of the idol as it relates to the appearance or form of the divine. And we do have lots of idols in the ancient world where it sure looks like the form of the idol was intended to tell us something about like what Dagon looked like. What's important though is that although that may or may not have been common, there's actually debate as to how common that was, it's not intrinsic to idols. You have idols in the ancient world that are lumps of rock, some are just sticks, some are abstract, they're like just circles or geometric figures or whatnot. So there doesn't seem to be anything in the way people were thinking about idols that required an idol to, like the form of the idol, to literally look like the form of the divine being. The reason I find that important to point out is because you do have, again, a bit of a minority tradition in Christian theology that took kind of that morphic, that form approach to the image. But as soon as you do that, like there's the temptation to try to figure out which humans look more like God than other humans, right? If there's a literal physical resemblance, where does that resemblance lie? What does it look like? And can I now categorize based on appearance? It might not be necessary to that view, but it's a temptation that has often slipped into a resemblance more or less way of doing things, yeah.
Thank you for a lecture, it was great. But in your line of understanding, where does this feeling with the spirit comes? Is that correlate with this kind of infusion of the divine nature into the idol, or how do you negotiate? Or
yes, I always love that question because my answer is I have an entire other lecture that's on the spirit as it relates to the image of God. Yep. So yeah, there you go. Yep, I'll come back and we'll talk about this. The short, when I start, I always want to emphasize Jesus because I want to make sure we get a thoroughly Christocentric understanding of what the image is all about. But I think the image of God biblically is thoroughly pneumatocentric. It's all about the spirit. I think divine presence is a spirit concept, biblically speaking. So I do think when we talk about God making us in his image according to his likeness in Genesis 1, that's not just a statement about being made to be conformed to the image of the Son. That's telling us that we were made for the indwelling work of the Spirit. I think the Spirit's doing something in Genesis that is then realized and more greatly manifested at Pentecost in anticipation of the eschatological, pneumatological fulfillment of this thing God has been doing since the... So my story of human persons and the Spirit starts in Genesis 1, and it gets a little bumpy because of the fall, but it's kind of an acceleration through Pentecost on into the eschaton. Yeah. And then, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the lecture. Oh, sorry.
No, it was you, yeah.
Okay, especially the explanation of idolatry in ancient Near East. Theologians usually define Imago Dei derivative from their theology proper, so how they define the image of God right, is directly related to how they conceive of God, what attributes, call it, or what essence they emphasize. So what is it about God that is being manifested in the image of God, in your view?
Yeah, so I would actually, I want to get to your question, but I want to flip around the beginning part just a little bit, because I would at least ask whether I would say it is true that theologians have often claimed that they're defining the image by starting with who God is and defining the image. I think the historical reality might be more complicated than that, and I think there's a fair argument to be made that we have almost always defined the image in terms of broadly shareable cultural constructs. And we have generally kind of appropriated what the culture thinks it means to be human. We've defined the image in that sense. And then you've got questions to ask about to what extent has that concept of the image then actually shaped our understanding of who God is. And has historically the process kind of gone the other way. To some extent, that's actually what got me wrestling with the image in the first place. Because what struck me as I was first thinking about the image, at least in my American evangelical context, is how often we would refer to the image, we would talk about it as something that's very central to our understanding of what it means to be human, and then we would say nothing about what it actually means. And that was true in almost every context I was operating in. We would say this is central to a Christian understanding of what it means to be human, and then we would just leave it empty. with no kind of rich theological content. And what I think often happens, I don't think we're doing that on purpose. I think we're like honestly unsure about what the Bible means and what we ought to do with it. So we don't want to say more than we ought in that uncertainty. But what we have accidentally done is we've taken a concept, we've said it's super important, we've put it at the middle of our understanding of humanity, then we left it empty, and it has just gotten filled unintentionally with all sorts of cultural content, because our culture, whatever culture you have, has a lot to say about what it means to be human. And if you leave an empty space in the middle of your anthropology, it will get filled. There is no alternative. And then that's going to shape your understanding of the human person, and I think probably your understanding of God in ways that we're not even aware of. So it was that worry that got me into this in the first place. Your other question is a great one. It's one that I'm still thinking about. I do think that to be images is to be called to live faithfully as God's image bearers, and that faithfulness must have a shape to it. That shape, I think, is primarily Christocentric and pneumatocentric. It's Jesus and the Spirit that tells us what that shape looks like, but it's Trinitarian, right? Because Jesus and the Spirit are leading us into a God-shaped way of being. But I'm going to locate that primarily in my understanding of what faithfulness looks like as an image bearer. I don't think the concept of the image is primarily epistemological. It's primarily there because the image is giving us content to our knowledge of God. I think we have other theological resources for that. I think the image is fundamentally an ontological category. It's telling us what we are as these creatures. We're the creatures by whom God is manifesting presence. And then God reveals to us, this is the epistemological, he reveals to us who he is and how we ought to live in light of that reality. Yeah. All right, I think that, so many. I think I'm gonna have to say one more, and his hand was up first. Yeah.
So maybe I just missed it, but so it seemed like the image is like the divine, like God being manifested in us. But then I also thought I saw like 3 levels of this in it, like first maybe being non-believers, and then believers who have the Spirit, which is God, like being projected into them. And so then the non-believers would be not having this. Then on the other side, there's Jesus, who has, like in Colossians, it says like the fullness of God. So like, what's the difference between the image of God, like God's manifestation, and the Spirit in Jesus?
Yeah, great question. Especially since I didn't clarify, especially the Christian, non-Christian move there. I do want to say, starting with Genesis 1, all humans in the image, full stop. Which means I actually wouldn't make a distinction in the image between Christian and non-Christian. The distinction that I made has more to do with the role the Spirit is playing in that and our relationship to Jesus in that. But I don't think that changes our status as image bearers when we move from Christian to non-Christian. It changes the quality of our faithfulness, the quality of our existence, the way that we live in light of our reality as image bearers. So to be incorporated in Jesus and indwelled by the Spirit doesn't make me an image bearer. I was an image bearer simply in virtue of being human. I actually think that it was always God's plan to indwell us with the Spirit in union with the Son as a fulfillment of what he started in Genesis 1. So I think the plan from all along was to make us image bearers and for the fullness of that to arrive with Jesus and the outpouring of the Spirit so that we can receive the eschatological end toward which God is making us. That's like a third or a fourth lecture going on there. But I think all humans are called into that story. That intention is for all humans. Non-Christians aren't participating in the Christological reality that God has for us. They're still images. God wants that for them. They're just not experiencing it, if I can say it that way. But I do have at least a 2-level thing going on because I do think there's a qualitative difference between Jesus as the image and all other humans as being in the image according to the image. So I do have that kind of a distinction within the image going on, just no distinctions within the human part of the image. All right, I am not going anywhere, so if you all have questions, please feel free to come up, but I think we're out of time.